It's wonderful to welcome Professor Thula Simpson of the University of Pretoria once again to this program. In our last discussion, which was earlier this year, we discussed his magnificent history of South Africa. And today we're discussing his previous book. I hope I'm pronouncing the title correctly. Umkhonto we Sizwe, the ANC
Perfect.
Arms Struggle. Thank you very much. Yes, and we're discussing, well, MK. Like I said, the I guess the militant arm of the African National Congress. Welcome to the show once again, Thula. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for making the time. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, so the reason why I was interested in your book is because there's a new incarnation of MK or Umkhonto we Sizwe um, emerging in South African politics. Now, as far as I can tell, Jacob Zuma, the former president of the country, did not found the party, but has been named the figurehead of the party. So, what do you make of this new MK incarnation?
Jacob Zuma was a young ANC member when the Umkhonto we Sizwe was founded in 1961. He was actually arrested in 1963 on his way to what was then Bechuanaland and today Botswana. What happened then was that so many young people who were going abroad to receive military training were arrested that the South African government got sufficient intelligence leads to spread them to ANC recruiters across the country. And that information indirectly led to the famous Rivonia raid of July 1963, which is when the Umkhonto we Sizwe's first high command was rounded up. So Jacob Zuma then spends 15 years in prison. He's released in the early 1970s. He retreats to Swaziland, where he's integrated in ANC structures. That's when he first starts working with Thabo Mbeki, who would be the South African president who directly preceded him. And he later became the ANC's commander from Mozambique. He was actually, just a quick correction for what I've said, he was released in around 1973, so it wouldn't have been a 15-year term. That's the only correction, but the rest is accurate.
Right. So, yeah. So I was asking about the current MK party. So, how did Zuma become sort of the figurehead of this new movement?
If a South African version of the musical Hamilton was written, it would be based around a figure like Jacob Zuma, a figure of a humble origins who rose throughout the movement and he became a major leader in the process. Jacob Zuma rose to become the vice president of the South African Republic, and he became the president who succeeded Thabo Mbeki. What is important about him is that he is of the Zulu ethnicity. And before the advent of colonialism changes everything, of course. It creates the identity of Black South Africans as a group. But before then, there were no Blacks because there were no whites. So what you had was an indigenous framework in which the Zulus were the greatest empire of the time. With white domination having gone, we've got a situation where the Zulus are the largest ethnicity, but there's strong elements of conservatism, nationalism, and monarchy, faith in and support for the monarchy. And so, in terms of making the ANC competitive in KwaZulu-Natal, which is the name of the province now, which includes the old Zulu Empire, the need for a strong Zulu leader existed. And Jacob Zuma is the individual who filled that void. And he was able, therefore, to become an important figure in peacemaking in the early 1990s in the province of Natal, as it was then called, with the Inkatha Freedom Party. And he became the deputy president of South Africa and then the president of South Africa. So the Umkhonto we Sizwe Party is formed in the 2024 election campaign. He said that he would be voting for a new party which had been established already called Umkhonto we Sizwe, and not for the sellout administration, using his words, of Cyril Ramaphosa. Cyril Ramaphosa is the present South African president. He's being inaugurated today, but he usurped Jacob Zuma after Jacob Zuma completed his two-year term.
Mhm. So, how would you explain the enormous support around Zuma even after the trial? I believe in your book you documented the riot and the shutdown of the KZN KwaZulu-Natal province. Yes.
Power in KwaZulu-Natal and political hegemony has always been contested. The mobilization of the Zulu ethnicity through Jacob Zuma is a card that the ANC has been able to play. Under Jacob Zuma, the Zulus were the predominant element within the ANC and therefore in the country. Since then, they've been marginalized. In the ANC's elective conferences, we have votes for who are the top 6 members based on the votes that you get. And even before the 2024 election campaign, Zulus were excluded from that. So there's a sense of being marginalized by the ANC. And with that in mind, even before Zuma announced that he was going to be running for Umkhonto we Sizwe, the Inkatha Freedom Party was also gaining in popularity there. So those are factors which Zuma has been able to wield. The sense of Zulu marginalization in the post-1994 dispensation.
Yes, I believe in our previous conversation, you've predicted that the ANC will lose its majority in the upcoming election. Well, the election happened, and I think it did happen. The ANC did lose its majority. So tell me the significance of this new change.
It is a fundamental transformation in post-apartheid South Africa. The 1994 transition was from minority rule to majority rule, and we had a dominant liberation party. It was a similar transition in terms of its structure and content to ones which had taken place across Southern Africa, for example, in Zimbabwe with ZANU-PF, in Mozambique with Frelimo, and in Angola with the MPLA. Those parties are still in power to the present day, and not necessarily because economic and political performance has been stellar. It's because they've maintained hold of the levers of power, and there have been a number of controversial elections, and there's been a great literature which has developed about dominant liberation movements and their hold on power. What happened with the elections on the 29th of May is that the ANC fell below that 50%, and they fell well below that 50%. The question was, what would the transition be like? The transition has been overwhelmingly peaceful. That is a transition of the magnitude of certainly 1994, but it also sets a precedent which is similar to that which Nelson Mandela set in 1991, where he stepped aside rather than seeking to prolong his rule indefinitely. As well as the idea of a liberation party forever, we also have the phenomenon of the president for life. Nobody can match Nelson Mandela's stature and his charisma, so it became very difficult for subsequent presidents of South Africa to claim that they need to stay on for a 3rd term. It was not something which is accepted because the precedent has been set. What the 29th of May election result has done is it has set a precedent for the peaceful transition of power, not just between individuals in the ruling party. We've had that change from Mandela to Mbeki to Zuma to Ramaphosa, but also the potential for the transfer of power between parties. It's a major transformation, and it's a very important democratic precedent.
Yes, I understand that Ramaphosa remain the president. Nevertheless, I do read speculations before the election occurred that in order to form a government, the ANC would have to form a coalition, of course. The coalition partners can be either the Democratic Alliance, which is a more centrist, more moderate party, or the Economic Freedom Fighters, which is a more radical left-wing party. I believe Julius Malema is still the leader of that one. So what did the ANC end up doing?
Well, that choice was forced on the ANC by the fact that they fell so far below 50%. Everybody was anticipating that there would be, well, not everybody, but the vast majority of people, the preponderance of opinion was that they would fall below 50%, and it was a question of how much. If they'd got 45% or more, there was a possibility of forming coalitions with what South Africans call rats and mice parties after the rodents. The idea that these are small, ego-driven vanity projects or ideologically extreme parties. But if the ANC had over 45%, the path to 50% would have been would have been quite narrow. And what that would mean is that the prospects of any individual small party blackmailing them or demanding extortion or ransom for their political cooperation, it would have easily been able to be checked. In other words, you could pick another rats and mice party. The problem that was created for the ANC by getting 40.5% is that pathway is very complicated. There's 2 ways you could do them. Firstly, by a very long list of rats and mice parties, you could just get over 50%, but that would have been a very unstable coalition. And the ANC went into the election with its brand being identified by chaos, corruption, and incompetence. And a chaotic coalition would have caused them to lose even more support. Just a reminder, between 2019 and 2024, the ANC supporters dropped from 57% to 40%, so dropping like a brick. The alternative would be to seek a coalition with a major party, in other words, a party who got at least 5% of the vote. That sort of gets you into significant territory. And the three options there would have been the Democratic Alliance, which got about 22% of the vote, the MK Party, which got around 14% of the vote, and the Economic Freedom Fighters, who you mentioned, who got just under 10% of the vote. Those would have been the options. There's no compulsion for a coalition. What you could have had is what we call in South Africa, it's the term which is used, which is applicable in the South African context, which is a confidence and supply arrangement, which is even if you've got less than 40%, 50% of the vote, you can get opposition parties to vote for your candidate becoming the president of the country and voting on an issue by issue basis, but not coming into a formal coalition. The ANC, I think, has decided that its future lies in changing its brand identity with the electorate to one in which they have a reputation for stability and stable governance and economic growth. And therefore, they've chosen, there's no compulsion, they've chosen to go for a coalition. But because that was so divisive within the ANC, that plan A of seeking a coalition had to be whittled down into what they're calling a government of national unity, which is that they're not going to seek a specific arrangement with any party, but an arrangement which would be open to any party willing to work with the ANC. It would avoid them being cast on the petard of either being seen to lean to the right and forming an alliance with the Democratic Alliance, or leaning to the left and an alliance with the EFF and the MK, which would have scared the market in South Africa and caused a significant economic fallout.
So I do read that President Mbeki in an address to the nation, I believe it was 2022 or something like that. He said that well, he has seen that the ANC, there are some individuals who joined the ANC not for political motives, but to curry favors by being of that party membership. To what extent is his statement still rings true?
If it's in 2022, it wouldn't have been Mbeki as president because he left the presidency in 2009. But he was also called in as ex-president of the ANCR to sort of give legitimacy and drive out the vote to campaign for the ANC during the selection campaign. He did a few events, but then he stopped because he articulated the reason. He was concerned by the people whom he was being asked to campaign with, who were implicated in the phenomenon which we refer to in South Africa as state capture, which is basically corrupt arrangements with private businessmen. So he stepped out of the campaign and stepped out of directly campaigning for the ANC during this campaign because of his concerns.
So you've mentioned the end of apartheid. So what are some of the factors that led to its end in, I suppose, 1993?
The end of apartheid, I would date even earlier to 1990, when F.W. de Klerk decided to unban the ANC, release Nelson Mandela, and enter into negotiations. A fundamental issue there was the contradiction which people had predicted from and anticipated from the beginning of the apartheid system between the needs of the economy, which would need a skilled workforce that would involve training Africans up, having a stable, permanent, skilled labor force that would be what would be required to take South Africa to the next phase of economic growth. The migrant system on which the apartheid ideology was founded, the idea that Africans have their own homelands and they're only in white South Africa as guests. People predicted that that would not be economically sustainable in the long term. And also the fact that demographic patterns meant that it became increasingly difficult to police the African majority, especially as the African majority became more united and more militant under the ANC's banner. All of these factors, there are others besides, created a situation where it was not only not feasible, but also not desirable to continue trying to maintain this doomed system. So F.W. de Klerk, seeing the writing on the wall, he stated it to the South African population on a year-by-year basis. We're getting less and less of apartheid as more and more Africans migrate to the cities seeking economic opportunities. It's neither possible nor desirable to send this back. We need to negotiate because our international situation is getting worse. It's a multiple manifold crisis which the South African government is faced with by the early 1990s, and that involves them seeking to negotiate rather than create a situation which the South African Defence Force, on which the South African government is increasingly forced to rely in the face of growing internal and external opposition, basically tells them the scenario we're facing is one which cannot have a military solution. The horizon which we have is one which has been played out in white settler after white settler colonies in Africa, from Kenya in the 1950s all the way through to Namibia in 1990, where the white minority gradually loses power, influence, and authority. They're eventually forced to negotiate, but then the longer they take to reach that position and to grasp that nettle, the more unfavorable the negotiating position is. So the predecessor to F.W. de Klerk said, let's rely on the military as part of a total strategy, is what he called it. The military kept saying to the politicians that we cannot resolve this. That's another dimension to the crisis, but it's a multiple crisis, and all of them together lead to the decision of the F.W. de Klerk government to talk it out rather than fight it out.
Mhm. To what extent was the example of Rhodesia proof influential to the minority government of the time at South Africa?
Rhodesia was influential as just another example on the succession of white minority regimes which the South African Defence Force referred to. So between Mau Mau in Kenya and Rhodesia in 1980, there was the example also of the Portuguese, who launched a protracted war in Africa, in Guinea-Bissau, in Mozambique, and Angola. They eventually decided they could no longer endure the conflict. One of the quotes at the time of the Carnation Revolution in 1974 was that the armed forces had reached the point of neurological exhaustion. The point they're making there is that these are not conflicts which have a military outcome. There's no prospect of Frelimo marching into Lourenço Marques, but it reaches a situation of protracted, deadlocked warfare, which leads the minority population into a situation where, whilst they can militarily continue, psychologically they can no longer do the same. And exactly the same happened with Rhodesia. There was, whilst Robert Mugabe's ZANU-PF had made significant headway in the eastern parts of ZANU-PF, of Rhodesia, where they were dug in, there was no immediate prospect of the guerrilla forces marching on Salisbury, which was the name of the capital, Harare, at the time. But the white population was simply exhausted by constant conflict, the erosion of the economy, constant emergency conditions, settlements which continue to fail. There was a huge amount of demoralization manifested in emigration, which is a major problem for a population which was never above about 270,000 in a population of 6 million. That was as good as it got demographically. So South Africa and the Defence Force, which for up until 1974 had sent troops to support the Rhodesian regime. After the 1980 elections, which sees ZANU-PF win, again, the significance there is that it's a radical Marxist regime. In other words, by holding on longer than they should have, they created an increasingly unfavorable situation. The African population became increasingly radicalized. I've given you the long version of the story, but in a nutshell, the message which is coming to South Africa from Rhodesia is that the longer you hold out, the worse settlement that you're going to be able to achieve.
Tell me about Mandela's sentencing, which got him 27 years in prison. I believe it happened under the premiership of one John Vorster, right?
No, it was under the premiership of Hendrik French Verwoerd, who was the Prime Minister of South Africa from the late 50s until his assassination in 1966. Mandela was arrested and sentenced twice. The first was in 1962. He'd left the country illegally. He entered the country illegally. He was known as the Black Pimpernel because the South African security forces were seeking him everywhere. So the 1962 arrest and conviction is for leaving the country illegally and launching an illegal strike, which he'd done in 1961 to protest against South Africa becoming a republic. It had previously been a dominion within the British Empire. The arrest in I've mentioned the Rivonia raid, where the command of Mkhonto we Sizwe is arrested. That leads to a new trial because what happens when the underground hideout is uncovered in Lillisleaf is that there are documents which incriminate Nelson Mandela and make clear his involvement in Mkhonto we Sizwe. So when we speak about the 92 convictions, it was for passport violations and launching a strike. It's not for being involved in armed struggle. So he gets sentenced again in 1964 for his involvement in Mkhonto we Sizwe. It wasn't a 27-year term, it was a life term, but it ended after 27 years when FW de Klerk said, let's negotiate rather than fight it out.
Yeah, tell me about the assassination attempt against Prime Minister Verwoerd.
Well, there's an assassination attempt which takes place in 1960 by a white farmer by the name of David Pratt. It is unsuccessful, but there's a successful assassination attempt which takes place in September 1966 by Dimitri Tsifendas, who is a colored, which means in the South African context simply a mixed race messenger in the Houses of Parliament. He steps whilst Verwoerd is about to be involved in a parliamentary debate. Tsifendas, who's a parliamentary messenger, steps into the chamber and he stabs him to death. And that's the assassination of Verwoerd in September 1966.
To what extent can we discern the motive of the successful assassin?
It's very difficult. He becomes a president's prisoner, basically because the psychiatric evaluation is that he is mentally unstable. Just before he conducted the assassination, I've forgotten exactly what the the passage in the Bible was. Josias, I think it is. He basically said he found that passage speaking to him, and he went out and he conducted the assassination. So he died in president's detention on the basis that he was a psychiatric case. But there's been a book published by Harry Dumetsis based on Tsifendas, which seeks to appropriate him and identify him as being a freedom fighter, points to the fact that when he was born and brought up in colonial Mozambique, he was repeatedly in trouble with the colonial authorities for various political acts, not violent in any way, but just dissidents within the colony. So there's been an attempt to appropriate him as being a freedom fighter and the assassination as being an act of liberation. I mean, those are basically the two contending theories.
I understand that within the old regime, the two major parties were the National and the United Party. The National is the one that remained dominant throughout that period. So what were the main divisions between these two parties?
So the National Party defeats the United Party in the 1948 elections, and the National Party will be in power of South Africa until 1994. Effectively, the country is a one-party state. The issue in the 1948 elections was the issue of apartheid, and it's very important to remember that there's a tendency sometimes to subsume apartheid and colonialism and segregation and minority rule as all being a bit of a melange, but you've got to understand that apartheid had criticisms from the white supremacist perspective. Basically, people who are saying that this is a fanciful ideology. Why the National Party begins articulating apartheid is that segregation, old-style segregation of the South African black population in the native reserves begins to break down as a consequence of the force of industrialization, which means that the economic landscape changes, opportunities are based in the cities, people want to migrate there. So what the critics of apartheid basically say is that this is actually a desirable feature for the continued growth of the economy and the prosperity of the white minority, making sure that we have the labor force. It can't be fitted into the square peg can't be fitted into the round hole of old style segregation. So that becomes an issue in the 1948 elections, and the National Party is actually very sensitive to it. So one of the constant responses to the critics of apartheid is that, look, no, we're not crashing the economy. What we're doing is just gradually moving towards ultimate territorial segregation. But it's not something that they're ever able, they're never able to reconcile this policy. So you've got to understand apartheid as being a policy which is constantly shaped by its contradictions. The United Party is faced with a problem, though, which is that apartheid proves to be an election winner. The National Party continues getting more and more votes, basically as a result of its determination to resist African nationalism in increasingly violent forms. So the United Party won't make it until 1990. It actually breaks up in the 1970s because it has lost election after election. The opposition votes becomes fragmented between right-wing and left-wing splinter groups.
Do we still see remnants of both the National and the United Party in the current political landscape of South Africa?
Very distant legacies and genealogies. Actually, the after 1994, the idea of black and white parties working together was so popular. There was a government of national unity which broke up in the 1990s, but there was still this idea that it's something that needs to be done. So what you actually had was the National Party. It died its death being incorporated in an alliance with the African National Congress. And that's where it disappeared. All of its resources were incorporated in there. As far as the United Party, it split in three. Well, it had split in the 1950s when a progressive party was established. It split again in the 1970s, where another liberal breakaway established what was called the Progressive Reform Party. That became the Democratic Party in the 1980s, and the Democratic Party is the precursor of the Democratic Alliance. But there have been a whole series of mergers and acquisitions which take you from the United Party to the Democratic Alliance of today.
So was there resistance to apartheid as soon as it was implemented, or the resistance began like some years after?
There was resistance which is spearheaded within Parliament and outside Parliament. I've spoken about within Parliament, United Party criticising it from the white supremacist point of view, so I won't dwell on that any further. But with regards to extra-parliamentary opposition, that is basically where the ANC came into its own as the torchbearer of African nationalism. In 1949, they passed what they called a program of action. Until then, African resistance had been focused on petitioning, negotiating, seeking a settlement with the white minority. But in the 1949 program of action, there's a shift to direct action, to mass action, to strikes and to protest, direct confrontation with the regime. And that conflict, as the government becomes more authoritarian with the apartheid policy and the ANC tries to develop more effective forms of mass resistance, is the conflict which will intensify during the 1950s. It will become more radical to the point where in 1960 the ANC is banned as an organization. It responds by forming Umkhonto we Sizwe, and from December 1961, we are entering the era of South African history, which is that of the armed struggle.
So how did Nelson Mandela become part of the ANC?
Nelson Mandela became part of the ANC in the 1940s when he joined the ANC Youth League, which is a branch established as part of a program that the ANC develops of trying to organize the nation. So in the 1940s, it's not just a youth league which is established, but there's also a women's league which is established. So that's the entrance into ANC politics of leaders such as Oliver Tambo, Walter Sisulu, and Nelson Mandela, who will dominate ANC politics for much of the second half of the 20th century. Those leaders will rise through the ranks into positions of greater responsibility. In the early 1950s, Nelson Mandela becomes the ANC leader in the Transvaal province. He will lead campaigns. So when I spoke about him being arrested for launching a strike in May 1961, when the South African government declares that it's going to establish a referendum after a republic after winning a referendum in October 1960, he's the person voted to lead that campaign. And then again, he will become the first commander-in-chief of Umkhonto we Sizwe when it is established in 1961.
So was now Mandela's wife Whitney, was she involved in ANC's activities when they met?
She became increasingly involved in ANC activities, and also when he was arrested, she became the torchbearer, the beacon of the legacy, and she becomes somebody who's increasingly active, not just as a symbol, but also somebody who formed connections with underground operatives of MK. In fact, she was sufficiently a threat or considered a threat to their regime, that they banished her to a place called Brandfort, which is in the present-day Free State province, which was considered to be sufficiently out of the way that she could no longer affect politics in the country, but it was not successful. She continued to be a symbol and a beacon of the Mandela legacy for successive generations of activists.
So how did Mandela spend his 27 years in Robben Island?
Well, it wasn't all in Robben Island. He got moved to Pollsmoor in 1982, and then he subsequently moved to Victor Verster, which is a low security prison from where he's released in 1990. The first years were extremely hard. There were activities such as breaking rock in the uh, sweltering sun, those kind of activities to break their spirit and to break their morale. But as the apartheid regime enters into a crisis in the 1970s, there's growing international pressure and growing calls to release Mandela. His conditions are the conditions of his imprisonment are greatly relaxed, and in fact, the negotiations, in a sense, start whilst he is in a special ward at Pollsmoor Prison after he had an operation in the mid-1990s. The Justice Minister at the time, somebody by the name of Kobe Coetzee, visits him in prison and says, I just met Winnie Mandela on a plane trip. They start chatting, and they start probing to what extent would he be a acceptable negotiating partner if they were to release him. So from the mid-1980s, he's under very low security prison conditions as these apartheid government starts turning to him as a potential means of escaping the dead end, the futile trajectory that they're on during that period.
To what extent did the Sharpeville massacre provide the catalyst for the creation of MK?
Sharpeville Massacre is an important watershed, and it's actually not organized by the African National Congress, but the Pan-Africanist Congress, which is a part of the ANC until it breaks away in the 1950s, because it is inspired by the achievement of independence in other African countries in the continent. Remember, Ghana in 1957 becomes independent, and Guinea-Bissau will also do the same in, sorry, not Guinea-Bissau, French Guinea, Sekou Touré's Guinea, Guinea-Conakry in 1958 will also become independent when it rejects de Gaulle's offer of becoming a member of the French Commonwealth. So the Pan-Africanist Congress is attracted by the examples of what is happening north of the Limpopo, but it's also repelled by the ANC's policy of multiracial cooperation with other racial groups in the country and its position on the land question. So what they do, what the establishment of the Pan-Africanist Congress does is it creates a situation that had not existed before, where there is rivalry between liberation movements and the ANC has competition. So what the Pan-Africanist Congress does is that after the ANC at a December 1959 conference announces that it's going to start a campaign against the past laws on the 31st of March 1960, the Pan-Africanist Congress, which meets a few days later in December 1959, says, we're going to try and upstage that by launching an anti-pass protest before that. The passes are a system of, it's called influx control. It's a means of regulating African movement. So if you're going to have a system of segregation where Africans are not allowed to be in white South Africa, you need to have a mechanism of enforcement. The mechanism of enforcement is that you have to be prepared to produce your pass on demand of a police officer. If you can't, you're imprisoned. It's an essential staple of the apartheid system. So the Pan-Africanist Congress calls for the demonstration on the 21st of March. Circling back to what I said about the aspect of numbers in the South African struggle. What I mean by that is South African blacks had basically come to an understanding which informed political engagement, which is, to a certain extent, a minority can only maintain its power over the majority if, to some degree, that majority consents to its subjugation. So what the plan of the PAC was that protesters would arrive at police station on the 21st of March, openly flaunt the fact that they're not carrying passes and demand that the police arrest them. The rationale was that if the police went ahead and arrested them, the prisons would soon overfill, the justice system would collapse, the economy, which relied on African labor, would take an unacceptable hit. That would be option A. Option B would be to not arrest them, which would mean that the whole system of parcel administration would collapse. What that policy entailed, however, was crowds appearing at the circumference of police stations that day. And what you had at Sharpeville was a police line that panicked. It created a chain effect where other police started opening fire. Most of the protesters were shot in the side or the back. It was a massacre in which the close proximity between the policemen and demonstrators created a panicked reaction, which threw the country into crisis, led to the declaration of a state of emergency towards the end of March 1960, and the crisis and the emergency led the VUT to ban the ANC and the PAC early in April 1960.
I understand that the past laws were the target of Mohandas Gandhi's demonstrations and resistance during his time in South Africa. To what extent did that change the past laws subsequently?
The Indian passive resistance campaign was launched to the introduction of a registration scheme where South African Indians in the Transvaal province would have to carry certificates of registration that they had the right to live in that province, because the area where Indians had first entered into South Africa was Natal province, but the Transvaal was the province where gold was discovered. It was the center of the economy. Like Africans before and after, people wanted to migrate to where there was opportunity, and the Transvaal colony wanted to introduce an influx control policy. And so they started mooting the extension, essentially, of passes to Indians. The pass system had basically existed since the British administration in the Cape early in the 19th century. After the Napoleonic Wars, it had been applied to Africans in one form or another, and coloureds in one form or another since then. So the passive resistance, which is adopted by the South African Indian population in the early 20th century, is a response to the proposal to extend the pass law in all but name system to them.
Tell me about the origin of the name Umkhonto we Sizwe, or as it is translated in English, Shield of the Nation.
Not shield, but spear.
It's spear.
And the reason why it is adopted and the symbolism of the spear, obviously in modern warfare, you don't fight with spears, you fight with firearms, cannon, and other explosives, but it's a link, it's a symbolic link to what are called the Wars of Dispossession, which is basically the colonial conquest of the indigenous African majority in the late 19th century, where many Africans did fight with spears. It was the traditional form of weaponry. The Zulu Empire was established in the early 19th century by a military genius by the name of Shaka Zulu, who eschewed the use of firearms. So the Spear of Nation is connecting the past, the mid-20th century present, with that past of resistance to colonial incursion and encirclement.
Okay. So what were the strategies and tactics adopted by MK?
It's firstly a graduated response. You can find and access the MK Manifesto, which is issued on the day of its first operations, or the official day of its first operations of 16th December 1961. It speaks about the formation of Umkhonto we Sizwe as being a warning shot, a message to the government that its path of escalation and repression will lead to the potential of civil war. It's because of the idea that this is a warning shot that the first year of ANC operations focus around sabotage, with the idea of there being bloodless operations, basically to alert the government and create a climate in South Africa which is susceptible to a negotiated settlement rather than civil war. But the government responds by increasing its repression. That includes passing legislation which provides for the death penalty for involvement in acts of sabotage. And as a result of that, the ANC starts changing its thinking. And during the year of 1962, it starts initiating plans for guerrilla warfare. So you'll see, if I'm sure that a search for Mandela and guerrilla, as in guerrilla warfare, will bring up the images of the training that he undertook during his tour of Africa in 1962. It's basically getting him prepared for the possibility of becoming a leader in guerrilla warfare as the leader of Umkhonto we Sizwe. So there's a plan for guerrilla warfare, and there's many abortive attempts to wage a fully fledged guerrilla war in South Africa in the years between 1962 and 1990, but none of them succeed. I think there's a statistic which the South African government circulates, which is verifiable, and it's accurate because there's a sense in which you can't sort of fake dead bodies. That's the one reliable crime statistic that police then and before have, which is that less than 100 people were killed by ANC operations in the 30-year period between 1962 and 1990. So the South African government succeeds in keeping it as a very low intensity insurgency.
Now, aside from Mandela, and you've mentioned Jacob Zuma, who are the other major members of Umkhonto we Sizwe?
Well, speaking about the first high command, it would be Mandela's associates, Walter Sisulu, for example. Joe Slovo, he's a white communist from the South African Communist Party who co-founds Umkhonto we Sizwe with Nelson Mandela because they're working together. He brings South African Communist Party units into the unit. So Joe Slovo is another very prominent individual. One of the few people who literally was there from the first shot in anger on the 15th of December 1961 all the way up until the end was somebody by the name of Ronnie Kasrils, who wrote a very lively and engaging autobiography titled Armed and Dangerous. Chris Hani is another important Umkhonto we Sizwe figure. He's assassinated in April 1993 by a white right-winger. And then there's the whole pantheon of martyrs who mean a lot within the South African firmament, people who led missions into South Africa, infiltrations, but ended up being executed. I'm speaking here about people like Solomon Mahlangu and Andrew Zondo and other individuals like that.
Yeah, tell me more about the ties between the ANC and the South African Communist Party.
The South African Communist Party is formed as a consequence of the Bolshevik Revolution. So you had South African white left-wing organizations who decide to unify themselves into a communist party, taking inspiration from Moscow, and it's actually called the Communist Party of South Africa. And it lasts until 1950 when it is banned as a result of the Suppression of Communism Act within South Africa. That has the consequence of creating a 3-year hiatus where communists have basically had their own organization disbanded, but they still want to remain active in politics. And that heralds a very important process where they start trying to integrate themselves into the broader Congress movement, so-called, because it is led by the ANC as its largest constituent. So there's an organization formed in 1953 called the Congress of Democrats, which brings together many former white communists. So when I speak about Joe Slovo, he is a member of the Congress of Democrats. His wife, Ruth First, is, as well as are other figures such as Jack Hodgson, who was the first bomb maker in Umkhonto we Sizwe. He's the first person who taught ANC operatives how to build handmade bombs. But what the homemade bombs, sorry. What happens in 1953 is that the Communist Party of South Africa members basically say, we're not going to accept being banned as an organization. We're going to reconstitute ourselves into a new organization. And that is when you have the South African Communist Party as opposed to the Communist Party of South Africa. Basically, it's the old Communist Party, but it's reconstituted under a slightly new name. So whereas previously it had been the CPSA, it becomes the SACP. But they continue their policy of trying to work with the African National Congress. And it is that alliance above all which provokes the Africanists, as they're called within the ANC, to break away to form what they call the Pan-Africanist Congress, because they feel as though the dog is being wagged by its tail as far as the white communists and Indian communists are concerned.
So there were, I suppose, ideological and political differences between the Africanists and the communists of that era.
Absolutely, yes.
Right. And what about the broader international communist movement? To what extent was did the ANC receive support from that?
First meeting of Oliver Tambo as the ANC president to the Soviet Union, sorry, is actually in the early 1960s, and that's something which is made possible by the South African Communist Party. A very important watershed as far as the relationship between the ANC and the South African Communist Party is the actual formation of Umkhonto we Sizwe, because it provides a means until 1969. Only Africans could be part of the ANC. So when we speak about the Congress of Democrats being formed in the 1950s, it's because there's still this stipulation that only Africans can be part of the ANC. Cooperation with other racial groups will require them forming other pillars of the Congress alliance. But Umkhonto we Sizwe, in a sense, it's the first non-racial organization where members of various races can be part of the same organization within the Congress alliance umbrella. What is important and enables the Communist Party to grow and influence is that after the formation of Umkhonto we Sizwe, the ANC has decided on a policy of armed struggle. To do that, unless you're going to be forever working with homemade bombs created by Jack Hodgson, which are low intensity, you need access to grenades, guns, and other paraphernalia of warfare. Who are the providers par excellence as far as that is concerned? Well, you could turn to the West, but the West won't provide support, so you turn to the East. And it's through the South African Communist Party that the ANC is able to establish strong relations with governments like Czechoslovakia, East Germany, and above all the Soviet Union, who will provide training, access to weaponry. And that's an important element of the alliance between the ANC and the South African Communist Party. It enables the South African Communist Party to grow and influence within the organization, but it also creates a permanent deposit where the communist states create a situation where the ANC as an organization will look to the other side of the Iron Curtain for support and solidarity. And it's created certain bonds of affinity and allegiance, which endure to the present day and have been inherited by Vladimir Putin's Russian state.
So does the South African Communist Party still exist today?
It exists in what is known as a tripartite alliance with the ANC, and the third constituent besides the South African Communist Party and the African National Congress is the Congress of South African Trade Unions, which was formed in 1985, and its first general secretary was Cyril Ramaphosa himself.
So speaking of the National Party, so did under the premiership of Evo, did it become more repressive towards the majority population, or did
Absolutely, yes.
Oh.
Yeah, it became hugely more repressive. There'd been a cycle of repression which had been going on since the National Party was voted. So when we speak about the South African this Suppression of Communism Act of 1950, that's not just a legislation for getting rid of the Communist Party. It defines communism as anybody who seeks to promote political change by means of mass protest or other disturbances. And that also affects the ANC with its program of action, which I mentioned earlier. It had agreed in 1949. So you get increasingly repressive legislation during the 1950s. And there's further legislation by HF Verwoerd, which continues that cycle. I mean, amongst other measures, as we've mentioned, it's under HF Verwoerd that the opposition parties are banned outright in 1960, which is enforcement of legislation which was actually passed in the early 1950s.
Yes, it's always been the case, I think, in like one-party states or even one-party democracies that the ruling party always has like factions within it. And I wonder, was it the case within the National Party as well?
That's a really interesting question, and the answer must be yes, because there were breakaways from the National Party. Many of them were to the right. In other words, people arguing that they were too liberal. Organizations such as the Gestichte Nasionale Partij, the HNP, which broke away in the early 1970s over certain liberalizations in terms of providing for multiracial sports, or the Conservative Party, which broke away in 1992. But then also, very importantly, there's a split which leads to the negotiations in the late 1980s, where basically there's an important faction in the National Party which achieves critical mass, which basically says that the reform program, which is undertaken by the president at the time, P.W. Botha, doesn't go far enough because the only way to create sustainable peace is to negotiate with your enemies. There's a saying from the Israel-Palestine conflict that you don't make peace with your friends, you make peace with your enemies. It applies similarly in South Africa, and the only way to achieve peace in the South African context, they argue, these dissidents within the National Party, is to actually grasp the nettle and approach the ANC. So yes, there's constant factions within the dominant party framework of the National Party rule.
And what was the framework of factions within the African National Congress?
Well, from 1999 elections, you had the breakaway of the party called the United Democratic Movement, and there have been breakaways in subsequent elections. In fact, almost every election has seen an important breakaway. One of the most significant until 2024 was the 2009 elections, where after Jacob Zuma took power and he unseated Thabo Mbeki, there were a group of, they were called Mbekiites or loyalists to Thabo Mbeki, who broke away and formed an organization called the Congress of the People, which did well in its first elections, but when it got 7.5%, but that would prove to be its high point. It's been on a continual decline since then. And I think that it was finally wiped out in the 2024 elections. You know, they might still be trying to endure on their 0 point something% vote. But then another important breakaway was the Economic Freedom Fighters ahead of the 2014 elections. And of course, most significantly ahead of the 2024 elections, there's been the MK Party, which is the breakaway, which has gained the most traction.
So back to the days of apartheid, was there a debate or a conflict between the non-violent wing of the ANC and the MK Umkhonto we Sizwe, the more militant wing?
Indeed, there was. Yes, the president of the ANC since 1952 was somebody by the name of Chief Albert Luthuli, who was the first Nobel Peace Prize winner of South Africa. And he got the award in 1961, posthumously for 1960. There'd been no winner for 1960, but he got the award in 1961 based on the idea that he was the person who'd done most to advance peace in the world. And he got the award for constantly preaching nonviolence. But there's actually an irony, because by the time he goes to Oslo to collect the award in December 1961, he has been privy to negotiations where Nelson Mandela has been pushing within ANC leadership structures for acceptance of armed struggle. Luthuli's resistance to Mandela's call led to a special arrangement in the first year or so of the Umkhonto we Sizwe's existence, where it existed as an autonomous body, but Nelson Mandela would have to report back on what is happening. In other words, when I say autonomous, it wasn't an official organ of the African National Congress. That only happens in 1962 when the ANC in a sense appropriates it. So strictly speaking, it's not correct to speak of Umkhonto we Sizwe as being the ANC's military wing until 1962. That's all a legacy of the opposition that many within the organization had to linking their organization with armed struggle. Why are they opposed? They're opposed because they think that even though the ANC is banned, there is scope for protest to continue within the country. And if you associate the organization with armed struggle, you're creating the position where the Verwoerd government can come in and basically try and crush the ANC as a whole in its entirety, which would be a disaster. That's why they sort of push against Nelson Mandela's drive for an official appropriation of the armed struggle. But gradually, as the apartheid government becomes more repressive anyway, the idea that the only alternative is to fight back grows in significance within the ANC, and you'll see the Umkhonto we Sizwe not just becoming accepted as being the ANC's armed struggle, but the ANC saying that the only path to power, the only conceivable path to power, is through armed struggle.
Now, to what extent was the ANC supported in the international non-communist war?
There was a very powerful anti-apartheid movement in the West, which is a strong barrier against attempts by conservatives there to diabolize the ANC and to brand it as being a communist organization. In other words, you had a powerful anti-apartheid movement, which was constantly willing to vouch for the ANC. And so the ANC was able to have headquarters in London throughout most of the struggle because there's a powerful anti-apartheid movement which is there. And also the anti-apartheid world must be extended to include the global south. So it's not just East and West, but there's also the huge global south where there's strong support for the ANC in the Afro-Asiatic world.
Yes. Tell me more about the ANC, the support for ANC within the African continent.
Well, there's practical support which comes in the form of, if you are the ANC and you've decided to make armed struggle the bedrock of your policy, but you're not able to operate within South Africa because there's such a repressive police state, you need external rear bases, transit routes at the very least, to get you to and from where you're receiving your training and back to the country in order to wage armed struggle. So you've got countries neighboring South Africa who become known as the frontline states, and it is as it sounds. It's basically their countries on the frontier of South Africa who face the potential wrath of the South African government for their support, tacit or open, of the South African government, of the African National Congress as a liberation movement. So you've got Southern African countries who provide transit routes. They provide bases, for example. Angola provides ANC with military camps on its territory, but they also provide important decisive votes in the international community. Basically, you can never get to the point of trying to marginalize or chastise the ANC in international forums because the Afro-Asiatic world gives a comfortable majority in the UN General Assembly and in other forums, which is basically means that the liberation movements have critical support in those international fora.
So when Mandela decides to retire Umkhonto we Sizwe, did he do so because the tactics and the strategies completed the objectives, or did he find that the same strategies and tactics were no longer necessary?
It's a mixture of both. So the ANC has Umkhonto we Sizwe has its last ceremony in December 1993 in Soweto. And why is it its last ceremony? It's because after that, the army is going to be reintegrated into the South African National Defence Force, as the South African Defence Force is renamed after 1994. But long before 1993, it becomes clear that there is even less prospects in South Africa than in other Southern African countries of the ANC's army marching into Pretoria. In a sense, the advocates of non-violence, that there have to be other ways of providing pressure on the government, they in a sense win that debate. There's a constant criticism within the ANC of the notion of excessive militarism, the idea that a military-only policy will lead to liberation. So long since 1993, the ANC has, well, first of all, in 1990, it had actually called off its armed struggle. It had called a unilateral ceasefire in its armed struggle, realizing that there was no military solution. So it's a mixture of both of your answers. Firstly, they realized that the tactic would not have by itself led to liberation, that other methods were more effective, but also it is ended as a result. The formal end comes because they're seeking reintegration.
So finally, how does understanding Umkhonto we Sizwe help us assess Nelson Mandela's legacy?
It's a very controversial one. First, the insurgency was extremely low intensity, so it's informed an argument that the armed struggle and the insurgency fails, and many people will argue that Luthuli actually has been vindicated by the outcome of the armed struggle, which proves that there were other methods which were more effective and that the armed struggle was in a sense diversion from that. But within that context, taking it as given that there are these other pillars of the struggle, such as the mass struggle and the underground struggle, the armed struggle enabled the ANC to become the standard bearer of resistance. It meant that when militants in the townships were looking for inspiration and for an organization to which they could join, the armed struggle provided that. The armed struggle also was a very important diplomatic lever. There's nothing inevitable that the ANC would have survived the experience of exile. If you take a look at the neighboring country of Southwest Africa, which is now Namibia, the leading liberation organization at the time of going into exile in the early 1960s was not SWAPO, which is the ruling party now. It's the West African National Union. What happened to SWANU? They refused to engage, or they engaged in an armed struggle, but it was much less effective. What the African nations did when they formed the Organization of African Unity is basically say, for us to recognize you, you must have an effective armed struggle. Because Swanee was not able to meet that condition, it got derecognized. What happens if you get derecognized? You don't get the votes at the United Nations. And if you're looking to carry Africa's favor as the Western power or the Eastern power, then you work through the African nations. To cut a long story short, the armed struggle was also an important diplomatic lever as well. The ANC would not have survived if it had not waged an armed struggle, not because the armed struggle was ever at any proximate stage on the verge of seizing power, but because as a diplomatic, political mobilization and other tool, it was absolutely necessary as an instrument within the arsenal of any liberation movement seeking to survive the context and the environment of Southern Africa in the late 60s.
With that said, thank you very much, Thula Simpson, for joining the program.
Thank you very much again. Cheers.